Okay, this video is going to cover the subject of narrative sequencing, linear versus nonlinear. And so by the end of the video, you should understand the basics, the differences between linear and nonlinear storytelling, and some simple suggestions for using nonlinear storytelling. Okay, remember as we go through, it's really important to look for the pencil. You shouldn't be writing anything down if you cannot see the pencil. So stop and take notes when you see the pencil, use the rule of 5, and pause as often as you need to. So the first thing we want to look at is, what is sequence? Well, a definition for sequence is the sequence of a story is the order in which the events are told. Not necessarily the order in which they occurred, but the order in which they are told. And there's two types of sequences. First of all, there's linear. This is where you stick with a straight chronological order. In other words, the order in which things actually occurred in real time. The nonlinear sequence is telling the story, the events out of order for some sort of narrative effect. We're going to look more closely at each of these and then specifically look at some examples of nonlinear storytelling. Okay, so let's look closer at what linear storytelling really is. Linear storytelling is going to start at the beginning. You don't skip around, and it's always going to end at the end. So if you think of it as that line from beginning, middle to end, you just start and you go all the way till you get to the end. Nothing gets moved around. Why would somebody want to choose linear storytelling? Well, it certainly makes it really easy for the reader to follow. You don't have to worry about flashbacks or anything like that. It's straightforward. So that's one reason why you might want to use linear storytelling. Nonlinear storytelling almost never starts at the beginning. It may include flashbacks, but it's still going to end at the end. It's how you get to the end is a little bit different. Usually people will choose to use nonlinear storytelling because it helps to emphasize the point of the story, or it will help to build the suspense in a way that you can't accomplish with linear storytelling. So let's look, before we go too far into nonlinear storytelling, here's some cautions that you need to be aware of. First of all, you only want to use nonlinear sequencing if it is going to make the story better. If it's just for fun, then don't do it. Also, your transitions must be extremely clear because you don't want your reader to get lost as you switch up the order of how things happened. Okay, pause. Remember to use the rule of 5. Okay, so our first example of looking at things in a nonlinear way, we're going to call it giving it away. This is where you actually start with the end of the story. Then you go back to the beginning and explain how you got there. Now that may seem a little bit counterintuitive. Nobody wants you to give it away, but there are some times where that can be very effective. Here's some tips and tricks for making it work. First of all, don't give the whole ending away. Just hint at it. Secondly, remember that this will create curiosity in your readers because they'll want to know, well, how did you get to that end? Let's look at a famous example, but don't forget to pause first and finish writing down those notes. Okay, famous example, Romeo and Juliet. A lot of people are familiar with the story of these two people that fall in love and eventually kill themselves. Well, Shakespeare tells the audience at the beginning that Romeo and Juliet are going to die, but he doesn't tell us how or why, just that they will die. Then, as the story unfolds, the audience is both curious as to how that's actually going to happen, and they also have this sense of hopefulness that maybe it won't happen. Maybe they really will win out, but yet they know they won't, and so it intensifies the audience's experience. All right, another example of a nonlinear storytelling is called in media res. Now that is Latin, and it means in the midst of things. And so instead of starting the story at the beginning, you actually quite literally start it somewhere in the middle. It could be the first intense moment, or it could be the climax, or a lot of different places. But once you've started there, you still have to go back and you fill in the exposition and the background and many other events that happened before that event, before you continue on with the story. Here are some tips and tricks for this one. First of all, you don't want to wait too long before going back and filling in the details, because you've started your story in a way that's going to create questions in your reader's mind. Well, if they don't get those questions answered fairly quickly, they're going to stop reading because they'll feel confused. So don't spend too much time before you go back and give the details. But do remember that this could be an excellent way of capturing the reader's attention, of creating those questions in the reader's mind so that they will continue reading and want to know more. Make sure you pause, use the rule of 5 before looking at the example. So our example for this one is the very first Star Wars that ever came out. It's technically the 4th in the series, called A New Hope. Here, this particular movie starts in the middle of a chase scene. The Empire is chasing some rebels, there's lasers going on, it's pretty intense, and you don't really understand what's actually going on until a little bit later in the story. But it does capture your attention, and the story's pretty quick to fill in the details so that you don't get lost. All right, the final one, the third one that we're going to look at is the frame story. Another way to look at this might be like a trip down memory lane. A frame story is where you pick a short, specific event that will act as a frame for what you want to say. So if you think of a picture frame, the frame holds the picture together. And what you will be doing is, as you tell this event, you'll include flashbacks that will help the reader understand why this particular moment is so important for you. Here's some tips and tricks for this style. First of all, you still need to tell whatever the main event is. That still has to be in the story. And you want to keep the flashbacks relatively short and make sure that they don't take more time than the event itself. All right, pause. Make sure you use the rule of 5 to write some of those ideas before we look at an example. Okay, here's a famous example. If you're familiar with the movie The Princess Bride, you understand that the beginning of the story takes place in modern day. It's a grandfather who's reading to his grandson who is sick. And he happens to be reading the story, The Princess Bride. Now, granted, most of the story in the movie is the book being read rather than what happens between the grandfather and the grandson, but it should still give you the idea of what a frame is, where there's a main event, and within that event there are flashbacks or connections to another story. Oftentimes, students will use this. This is an example of a good way to talk about somebody that you've loved that has passed away. The event that you're describing could be the funeral or the moment when the family was gathered together. And then while you tell about the funeral or that moment, you flash back to those memories that help show why that person is so important to you. That's one example of how you could actually use this. Okay, so your turn. What I'd like you to do is take this story idea that you're working with and just write out a quick plan that will show how you could use one of these 3 non-linear. So either the giving it away, where you start it with the end, or in media res, where you start in the middle, or where you use a frame to include flashbacks to things that happened previously so that the reader understands. Here's an example. In my half-done essay, I used in media res. I started with me standing at the base of the final ascent, kind of the inciting incident. Once I had you there and hopefully created some curiosity and interest in my story, and then I went back and explained how I got there, why I was there, etc., before I continued on until the rest of the story. So pause and write down just a quick possible plan for using non-linear storytelling for your essay. All right, so you finished watching. Don't forget that you need to write out the summary. Make sure you include specific information that you learned from the video. Also, make sure you get them submitted to Scooge and before you come to class. And if there's a digital list, you can do that before you come to class as well. All right, That's all, folks.